Welcome back to the NITE Economics YouTube channel, and tonight we're going to be looking at the US bond market. If you're liking the content, please subscribe to the channel, drop a like, and without any further ado, let's get into tonight's video. So I'm going to be looking at this Yahoo Finance article here. So this came out I think 6 days ago, August 19th. Today's August 25th, so this was last Wednesday. 30-year Treasury yield touches 19-year high. So if we look over here at the 30-year Treasury, which is sitting at 5.19% as of today, August 25th, and today's Tuesday, August 25th. Last week it hit 5.30%. And that's the highest it's been since 20 years ago, back in 2007, June-ish, around this time. So as you could see, the 30-year bond was trending down over a very long period of time. I mean, this one only goes to 1988, which back then it would give you a 10% receipt. That's incredible, right? 10% receipt is pretty nice. And it trended all the way down, and since then it's since pretty much since 2020, since the pandy, we've gotten a reversal, a big reversal, right? So now it's sitting all the way at just above 5%. Like I said last week, it hit 5.30, just over 5%, almost 5.5% return on the 30-year Treasury. And while we're at it, let's take a look at the 10-year. The 10-year is something very similar. I mean, it hasn't hit on I guess a 20-year high, if you will, but it's getting up there. Like, I mean, the last time it was this high or higher, well, I guess we had some spikes here January last year, April of 2024, and then it was quite a bit higher. Got almost to 5% over back in October 2023. And then before that, we would have to look all the way back here to July 2007 for us to see such a high return on a 10-year bond. So why is this happening? So essentially, long story short, is that let's just go through this article right here. So the yield on benchmark 30-year Treasury bond briefly hits a fresh 19-year high on Tuesday before pulling back slightly. The recent surge that lifted the 30-year Treasury yield above 5.3%, the highest since 2007, comes amid a global bond sell-off and worries about stalled risk to end the war with Iran, fears of persistent inflation, questions about monetary policy, and under new Federal Reserve Chair Kevin Warsh, and concerns about U.S. borrowing that has national debt poised to hit $4 trillion. That's a lot of debt. But this last part, this is something they can't change. We're in a debt-based system, so the debt is going to keep rolling over, and they're going to keep printing money. I think that is clear, especially by anyone that follows my channel. I think I mean, I don't talk about this specific issue all that often, but it's clear that this is something that we can't just get out of, right? Like we live in a debt-based system, and we need ever and ever more amounts of new money in order to pay off old debts, right? So we need to keep printing money indefinitely until the system essentially collapses on itself. It's pretty much a giant Ponzi scheme. One that works to a large extent, but regardless, it's a giant Ponzi scheme. So what happened? There was a massive bond sell-off, which caused the bond yields to spike, right here on the long end of the curve. So we're talking about the 30-year, and I guess to some extent as well as the 10-year. So the answer was the Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, decided to buy back a very large amount of long end of the curve. So between the 10 and the 30 year, they started buying a big amount of them in order to control the yield, essentially the bond yield, right? Because if the bond yield starts to surge too quickly, this could be problematic for people that are taking loans, people that are, for people that have mortgages, particularly if you don't have essentially if you have a floating mortgage. Forget what the term would be, the exact term, but essentially a yield. You don't have a set rate, is what I'm trying to say. You don't have a set rate in your in your mortgage, and the long end of the curve, the 30-year bond yield starts to go up. That's going to affect what you're paying monthly, in your mortgage, and this wouldn't be good for you, right? You're all of a sudden your expenses are higher and higher, especially as this bond, this 30-year bond starts to go higher. Is going to affect your mortgage directly, essentially. So the U.S. Treasury stepped in and started buying up 10-year, 30-year. I think here it says after the U.S. a pair of Treasury auctions over the past week have drawn notice for yields that reached long-term highs as a sale of $42 billion in 10-year notes cleared at a high yield of 4.6%, the highest in 19 years, while the most recent 30-year bond auction drew a yield of roughly 5.22, the highest since 2021. So essentially, they bought. So the way the bond market works is essentially, if people start selling, right? In this case, foreign entities, right? Foreign governments start selling their bonds, essentially. They start selling it, and they start selling a lot of them. That's going to cause the long end, in this case the long end of the curve, to start to go up. And the reason it starts to go up is because in order to attract investors, right, you want more return for you taking risk. In this case, the risk of buying a bond. So you want more return for that. And this happens naturally in the bond market, right? So it has an inverse relationship. Bonds sell, yields go up. Bonds are bought, yields go down because more people are buying it. They're attractive, and actually the price as the actual bond is being sold. If a lot of it is being sold, the price to buy the bond goes up. The price of the bond goes down as you're selling them, because now there's more in the market. They're being sold, so they're more abundant. I'm learning German, so I'm forgetting English. As weird as that is, English is my mother language. Anyway, they're becoming more abundant. There's more of them in circulation, so they're not as rare. So the price of each bond is going to go down, but the receipt you're going to get on that bond, in this case the yield, is going to go up. So it has an inverse relationship. So as the Treasury starts buying up bonds, right, the price of the bonds are going to go up, and the yield is going to go down, essentially. That's essentially how it works. That's the theory of it, right? So in a way, this is a type of yield curve control without the government actually saying we're gonna set the yield at this specific price. It's like a quasi way of doing it by them buying or selling bonds. In this case, the Treasury is buying a bunch of bonds, and I mean the Treasury is always buying bonds, really, but they're buying them directly they're not buying them directly. I mean, does the Treasury buy them directly from the Federal Reserve? And the Federal Reserve sells the bonds to other banks, and then the Treasury could buy those bonds off of the other banks in the United States. I believe pretty sure that's how it works. And so this is how they're controlling it, and why this is how they're controlling the yield in the bond market, particularly the long end of the curve. And why is this important, right? Like why does the U.S. government want to do this? Well, if like I said previously, if bonds keep going up and up and up, that's going to slow down the economy. And already there's you're having these problems with this war. You're having potentially the return of inflation. So yeah, and actually, if you follow the Uneducated Economist, I really recommend his YouTube channel. So I'll actually link it here in the description of this video, or just in the little card thing that pops up in the video. He talks about his theory. What's it called? The credible threat theory. And I think something like this, or what's happening in the bond market, actually plays directly into the hands of the credible threat theory, because if you know how essentially the neutral interest rate works, is that in order for the Federal Reserve to be able to really have power within the market, whether they can stimulate or contract the economy, they need to be able to get their power back in terms of, like, when they lower yields, that needs to be able to stimulate the economy. And because yields were so low, pretty much at zero, pretty much in like the in the Treasury side of notes, right? Not bonds, but like 1 year, 2 year 2-year yield was so close to zero for like about 10 years because essentially the Fed funds rate was so low. They lost their ammunition really to truly manipulate or to stimulate the economy. So if you understand the way the theory works, is that what actually stimulates the economy now is the words that are coming out of the Federal Reserve, essentially saying what they are going to do. Are they going to lower yields or raise yields? Is what actually causes the stimulation or the contraction of the economy, not the actual lowering of yields, because they were too close to zero for too long. So allowing the bond market to go up, and essentially also the short end of the curve will gradually start to go up as well, will allow the neutral interest rate to get below the Fed funds rate, right? Because the neutral interest rate, well, I guess the Fed funds rate needs to get below the neutral interest rate. That's what I'm trying to say. So this fear of inflation, this fear of the bond market, the long end of the curve going up, will actually push the interest rate up, and it'll keep pushing it up higher and higher and higher. And if the Fed funds rate stays where it's at, it doesn't. The Federal Reserve essentially doesn't need to do anything in order to stimulate the economy. Right? It's actually like it's weird to think about, but it actually benefits them if the so I'm losing my train of thought here. If the credible threat theory is correct, which I think it is correct. I think it explains a lot of things in ways that most other economists don't explain, or their theories don't explain so well, right? So it pushes the neutral interest rate above the Fed funds rate, and the Fed funds rate needs to be X amount of percent, and the amount of percent that needs to be below the neutral interest rate in order to stimulate the economy. You get different things if you read on the internet. You get different opinions on how low it needs to be, or how much below the Fed funds rate needs to be below the neutral interest rate in order to stimulate the economy. I've read some things of it having to be at least 5% below. Regardless, I think this plays right into the hand of the Federal Reserve, and thus not having to really do anything, and might actually benefit them to actually potentially raise yields in the next year or two, and thus when something like a big time recession does come, and I think one is looming in the next year or two, maybe 3 years, then they'll actually have ammunition to go in, lower interest rates, and that will actually give them back their power to actually stimulate the economy, not from just their words, but from actually lowering interest rate, which is what they used to be able to do essentially from before 2001. Before 2001, back in the 80s and stuff like that, with Alan Greenspan and all those old Federal Reserve chairs, they used to be able to just lower interest rates, and that would stimulate the economy. And mind you, they didn't have these giant press conferences talking about what they were going to do. That they just did it all in secret, right? It wasn't like a big thing like it is now. Now it's like a big thing. They announce it, for like 4 times a year, announcing what they're gonna do with the yield. Are they gonna lower? Are they gonna raise rates, etc.? And it's like a big thing. It's a big news event, and everyone's talking about it. But this is a relatively new thing. In the 80s and in the 90s, this wasn't a thing. Like I said before, the Fed chair would just lower it in secret. Well, not just him alone. I think it is the whole FOMC. They would do it. They would get together. They would do it, and then they would announce it after the fact. But there wasn't like a news conference. There wasn't a conversation to be had with the Fed chair. So that so like I think this is another thing that actually presents a lot of more validation to the fact that the credible threat theory likely is what's going on, right? And if you read, I think Ben Bernanke had an article that came out in early 2000s talking about how essentially, I'm pretty sure it was Ben Bernanke, or maybe it was a chair before. I guess before him it was Alan Greenspan, or was there another one before him? Anyways, I'm pretty sure it's Ben Bernanke talking about how they have lost their ammunition to essentially stimulate the economy, right? And essentially what they use now is their words, right? I'll find what the name of the article is if you're interested in it. I forget what it's called. It's one that the uneducated economist references quite often. And actually, I'll post a link to it below. I'll also post a link to his YouTube channel. I think it's fantastic. You'll learn a lot about the credible threat theory and just like a different take on markets and how macroeconomics works. Anyways, that's all I have for today's video. Again, if you guys are liking the content, please subscribe to the channel. It's very helpful for me. Drop a like if you're liking the video. If you dislike the video, also drop a dislike, not a like, a dislike. It's cool. My feelings won't be hurt. And yeah, if you have any comments down, put them down in the comment section down below, and I'll see you guys on the next video. Take care. Bye.